And now Saudi Arabia has come under fire by international rights groups for executing a Shia man for crimes he allegedly committed when he was a minor. Amnesty International said that Mustafa Hashem al-Darwish was a victim of Riyadh's deeply flawed justice system. Anti-death penalty group Reprieve branded the Saudi act as a human rights crisis and said that Mustafa's family was not notified prior to his killing. Both groups, as well as Mustafa himself, said the confession used for his sentencing was obtained under duress. Man was arrested in 2015. He was charged for taking part in protests in Saudi Arabia's eastern province in 2011 and 2012. Saudi authorities handled the protests by the country's Shia minority with a very heavy-handed crackdown. In 2019, the overwhelming majority of executions in the Arab Kingdom was comprised of Shia people. Joining us now for this news review is Kevin Barrett, author and Middle East affairs expert from Madison, Wisconsin, and Mr. Colin Cavell, former lecturer at the University of Bahrain, joining us from Bluefield. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both to the program. Mr. Cavell, we'll start with you. Your initial thoughts on this latest execution in the kingdom.
Mr. Mustafa Hashem al-Darwish was executed today by the Saudi monarchy, 6 years after his arrest for the 2015 protest of the illegitimacy of the House of Saud and its undemocratic rule. And at the time, Darwish was 17. So Saudi Arabia has killed someone who at the time of his crime was a child. They just kept him in jail, waited till they thought the world would accept his death, and then they killed him. And what did they kill him for, Mr. Arya? For protesting. So in Saudi Arabia, if you protest the illegitimate regime, you will have a death sentence on you.
Thank you, Professor Cavell. And Mr. Kevin Barrett, welcome to the program. It's very controversial. You're a kingdom. You're sentencing teenagers to death, some as early as 14 or 15 years old. A couple of years later, you carry out those death sentences. I don't know how far a due process goes in all of this, but your initial thoughts on this, please.
Well, there's no due process in Saudi Arabia, no fair trials. This practice of executing protesters is par for the course. Saudi Arabia has, of course, said that they've ratcheted down their executions, but I think what they mean is that they're maybe executing fewer murderers and executing more protesters. And so they claim also that they're not executing minors anymore, but they just did. They just executed Mustafa Darwish, who was 17 at the time of the protests for which he was arrested and charged, but not even given anything remotely like a trial. And the kingdom is playing on some kind of strategic ambiguity here, claiming that, well, we don't really know. He may have committed some crimes when he was older than 17 too, although there are no details about that, because the problem is that he didn't commit any crimes. The problem is he's just a protester, and he's not actually getting any due process. So they can say anything they want. They can make up anything they want. They can claim that even after he was arrested, that somehow he committed crimes, because there's no record. There's no judicial record of anything that he was clearly charged with. His lawyer was not given a chance to actually defend him. And so the whole thing is completely non-transparent. And that's par for the course in Saudi Arabia, one of the very worst human rights abusing regimes in the entire world and in the region. And it's shameful that the United States, my country, which is supposedly so dedicated to liberty and justice for all and human rights, is supporting the worst human rights violators around the world and in the region. The U.S. is propping up the Saudi regime, which wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes anytime during the past 50 years if the U.S. hadn't been propping it up. And of course, the U.S. is also supporting regimes like the Sisi regime in Egypt, which is executing and torturing political prisoners, and of course, the worst violator of all, the genocidal Zionist regime in Tel Aviv. So the hypocrisy on this is over the top. The Western media is just lying about all of this, And if the American people really understood what their government is doing, I don't think they would accept it. But our propaganda apparatus has everybody brainwashed. Fortunately, there is getting to be a little bit more attention paid to the atrocities of the regime in Saudi Arabia. And hopefully this execution of this protester who was a child when he supposedly protested will wake up some of the human rights groups and force them to make more noise about this.
And gentlemen, I think I spoke to both of you back in 2016 on January 2nd. If you both remember, the kingdom carried out a mass execution of 47 imprisoned civilians convicted for terrorism in 12 provinces throughout the country. 43 were beheaded and 4 were executed by firing squads, almost all of them protesters during that so-called uprising, which the kingdom has labeled all of them as terrorists. Among the 47, of course, was a popular cleric, Shia Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr. Why so much silence from the West when you have 47 people, 43, you have 3 dozen people beheaded, more than 3 dozen people beheaded in a single day? Why is your number one ally, the U.S., say nothing? It has such a strong voice, such a strong platform to lay into you, to have you change your human rights record. Why don't they? For Professor Covell, for Colin Covell, and then I'll let you finish, Mr. Barrett. Go ahead, Mr. Covell.
Mr. Area, the U.S. is an imperialist power, and they will take care of their subordinate allies to ensure that an undemocratic autocracy exists in the Middle East. They have to allow that autocracy to eliminate and treat with severe prejudice any opposition to that House of Saud ruling over 34 million people. With 34 million people, the kingdom can continue to pump out oil and supply the Western imperialist powers as long as they are in power. It's easier for the imperialist powers to deal with a single person or a single family than it is with a democratic regime. That's why they hate Iran. But they love Saudi Arabia, because then you can buy off the House of Saud and its family, and it's very easy to do and monitor them. So whatever is necessary to keep the House of Saud in power, they will do. With regards to the killings that you just mentioned, we also must note that most of them, just like Mr. Darwish, were of the Shia confession. So part of keeping the Saudi Arabian House of Saud in power is to make sure they suppress all of the Shia within Saudi Arabia and kill those who even protest the unjust existence of the undemocratic rule of the House of Saud.
And Mr. Barrett, final thoughts with you. How do you get away with it? How do you get away with chopping up people in your consulate, a U.S. resident for that matter? You behead young kids and religious clerics. How do you get away with it?
Well, they're getting away with it because the U.S. has descended into increasing corruption and oligarchy. I think 50 years ago, when there were stronger leaders, and a little further back, I go back to people like Roosevelt and so on, we had actual leadership in the government here in the United States. But since the murder of JFK in a coup d'etat by very corrupt oligarchs, probably supported by the State of Israel, among other forces, the U.S. has descended into more and more corruption. And now money talks, and of course the Zionist financiers have the most money, but the Saudis have a fair bit too, and there's a kind of a confluence of interest there between the big money Western banksters and the Saudi billionaire sheikhs. And so all of these corrupt oligarchical criminals scratch each other's backs and protect each other. And there's no legitimate government here in the United States. Since the September 11th false flag operation, we've had essentially a fake war on terror, which is legitimized, going after protesters here in the United States and all over the world. And so that's why the Saudis can call teenage protesters so-called terrorists. They use the T word, and then that gives them a license to chop off their heads. Likewise, here in the United States, they've, the Abu Ghraib atrocities, people raped and children raped in front of their parents, the Guantanamo atrocities, the ongoing monitoring of people here in the United States. We've really descended into an oligarchical dictatorship, a real hellhole. And even speaking about human rights in the United States and the West in the same breath is a joke these days. So it's deeply unfortunate, but the words of the big human rights organizations these days are unfortunately just hypocritical, because they're operating out of countries that are now ruled by criminal oligarchs who are getting worse and worse in their abuse of human rights all across the board.
Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us on the program and your input. Kevin Barrett from Madison, Wisconsin, Mr. Professor Colin Covell. They're joining us out of Bluefield. And viewers, that's a wrap for this segment of your Press TV's News Review program. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye for now.